Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today in your virtual space. Um, my name is Joanne Chung, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology in the University of Toronto, Mississauga. And today I'll be delivering my Brotherton lecture. I do want to say that I'm sorry that I wasn't able to give this in person, but I'm excited to share some of my thinking today. So in the next little bit or so, I'm going to share how my research journey led me to understand something fundamental, which is that meaningful engagement with research participants transforms both the research and the researchers involved. Okay, so I'm going to start by just saying, wow, like I have been doing some sort of psychological research for about 2 decades. And sometimes I'm always like, oh, I don't feel still new to the field, but it's been 20 years. Anyway, during the time that I've been active in psychology, I've observed psychological science go through different crises. And the biggest ones for me have been the replicability crisis and the lack of diversity in the field, both in terms of who gets studied and who does the research. And as a professor mentor, I'm often asked by students why I chose psychology. And when I reflect on it, there were so many reasons why I initially went into it. And the first reason that I can think of is that people are really interesting and complex. And the second is that improving people's lives seems like a pretty good thing to strive towards. The third is that people's feelings, thoughts, and behaviors can be considered within social context, which I think is pretty awesome. And then the fourth, which I now have a little bit more complex feelings about, but was really important to me at the time, was that models and statistics can help us understand reality. In essence, it can provide the truth about human behavior. My current research program mostly focuses on emotions, personality, and the development of each. For example, some questions I have are, how do emotions serve as informational signals in our lives? How do experiences of emotions shape personality over time? And how are cultural factors and people's life experiences related to differences in how people change over time? My interests have evolved through the years as a result of gaining experience in different methods and theoretical approaches and taking some time to reflect on them. So, today I'm going to talk about my research experiences in 3 different places in the world. We'll begin in the Bay Area and Sacramento Valley, California, in the United States, where I went to university and pursued graduate studies. I also grew up in California. Then I'll tell you about my time in Tilburg, the Netherlands, where I did my postdoctoral studies and then started my first assistant professor job. I'll then tell you about where I am now, which is in Mississauga and the Greater Toronto Area in Ontario, Canada. But like I mentioned before, I've been doing research in some way for almost 20 years, but I think to understand how I got to how I think about research now, it's important to share a little bit about my early research experiences. So I want to tell you that when I was young, I didn't expect that I'd be a researcher in psychology when I grew up. I actually wanted to be a visual artist. So here's me in the art club in high school, and actually this is my own a drawing that I did of myself when I was about 5 years old. When I was in high school, I was so into art that I quietly dropped out of my college prep courses to make sure that I wasn't eligible to be at a regular university. Here's some like drawings that I've done. These are from high school, of my friends and from my sketchbook and from my zines. Ironically, I still ended up going to like a regular quote unquote university where I pursued art practice. I thought since I was at university, I should do something in addition to art, but I ended up getting rejected from the psychology major. So what I did was I pursued something called interdisciplinary studies, which allowed me to take courses in education, sociology, philosophy, psychology, and anthropology. Here's some more work that I did during the college years. In the back of my mind, I was thinking I'd like to do something like art therapy. I thought it would like kind of bring together like two things that I really like. I started working part-time with autistic children, and in the end, I even wrote a thesis that consisted of interviews with parents regarding the effect of the diagnosis of autism on the family. And after university, I just kept making art. I hung out for a while, working a multitude of jobs, trying to figure out what I wanted to do next. And here are some additional pieces that I have made since college. I thought I might want to get more clinical experience. So what I started to do was volunteer at an autism clinic. This was the Langley Porter Psychiatric Institute for pervasive developmental disorders, where I was tasked with administering things like intelligence tests. And in California at the time, intelligence test scores are factored into getting an autism diagnosis. And if you got an autism diagnosis, then you could receive financial governmental support for treatment of children. And so this is really good for parents to actually receive a diagnosis. Um, and during this time, I really appreciated like I was getting really into individual differences. I was like, this is really cool. Every child is different from each other. One day I was hanging out with one of them, asking a standard question, and I had to do little tricks to get them to answer. So, for example, here's a question I would ask. I would be like, hey, what color is grass? And then typically I would get kind of, the child was distracted. And then I'd have to do something like sing A, B, C, D, E, F. And then, you kind of stop and pause and be like, this then the student would be like, oh, or like the child would be like, oh, I'm interested, I will answer this question, I will say that the grass is green, and then I would say yay and sing the rest, and then they would be distracted again. And this is a really pivotal part of my, I guess, research journey, or I don't know, like professional development journey, because I realized, okay, the score on the test hinges on their ability to pay attention. But how could this be? So when there's so much writing on the outcome of this intelligence test, is this really a valid way of diagnosing a person with autism? I knew then that what was next for me was to better understand measurement and psychological methods more broadly. So I went back to school. And I got my start in research on culture and emotion by getting into nonverbal expressions of emotion during a post-bac. Maybe some of you are familiar with that show, Lie to Me, but basically the premise of this stuff is that people express emotions through specific muscle movements on their face. And this is an evolutionary response to people's need to communicate for survival. And I got super into it. So I was really psyched about this research. I even, here's me kind of being goofy, like hanging out in the lab. And I even learned the entire facial action coding system to the point that I gained expert status. That's a thing. And one thing that I noticed during this time was that the research was heavily focused on broad cross-cultural differences, some based on literacy, so literate versus illiterate cultures, and maybe the most famous is Western versus Eastern cultures. So whether it was about their own nonverbal expressions of emotion or their perceptions of others, this is kind of dominating um, like anything to do with culture at the time. So I am a second generation Korean American, and I started to kind of have these thoughts where I was like, where do I fit in? Where do people like me fit in? Where, I'm raised in a Western context, California, but I have Eastern heritage. My parents are both from South Korea. At the time, I was just kind of like, okay, people are really into these like US, Japan, or like Western versus Eastern comparisons right now. Maybe I'll ask more about this at another time, as I was very young in the field. Another early experience I had was going to conferences who were where very well respected researchers who often just to add a little bit is that they did not appear to be Asian themselves, were talking about cultural differences in what I perceived as a very simplistic manner. On the one hand, I could somewhat understand given the constraints of the research methods used at the time. So here is like the classic, collectivist versus individualistic kind of dimension of culture. Somebody's talking about this at a conference. But unfortunately, like these types of talks or just hearing about this research, although I was like interested, I always kind of left feeling a little bit bad. And I'll try to explain this better, but although it was probably like not intended to come off this way, hearing people use sweeping generalizations about Asian people's psychology, including how they construed themselves, made me question my own lived experiences as an Asian person as well as those from my community. And these kind of statements started to make me question the dominant narratives. In grad school, I had the opportunity to collect data in Korea. to examine things like how people in places outside of the North American context might interpret nonverbal expressions of pride that were previously only examined in the US and Canada. So here are some stimuli, example stimuli where we show like photos of nonverbal expressions of pride. And we would, here's an example of a free response task where we just ask which emotions do you think are being expressed by the people in the photos? Please provide your responses in the spaces below. My brother conveniently was working as an academic translator at Korea University at the time, and I was psyched because, we got to collaborate. And here I got to collect data outside of the online context, outside of the lab, and it was really cool. So, like, yeah, I was having a really awesome experience hanging out on the quad, having people come and participate, meeting the participants. But here, although I think the study was done reasonably well, there were some things that I noticed that stuck out to me. So the first was that I noticed that participants wanted to take the survey together. My brother and I had to instruct them to answer to the best of their ability on their own when they would say, like, hey, can I answer with my friend? Second, we were asked several times about whether or not the task was about perceptions of race, which I had actually never thought of, but totally made sense as the only expressors in the stimuli we were using were black or white. And this got me thinking. Additionally, and later in my doctoral studies, my interest expanded to aspects of personality development in young adults. And I began to study things like what's the longitudinal trajectory of self-esteem during the university years. And all this stuff was done on data that have already been collected, so secondary data analysis. I remember being really excited about fitting statistical models with names like latent growth curves modeling and latent difference score models to again find out the truth. So I was like getting super jazzed about getting my quantitative chops. But at the same time, one thing that has stuck out to me was that using such techniques made it difficult to look at things like race, ethnicity, culture in more detail. So here's an example from one of my papers from grad school. You can see in the highlighted part, we write like to retain adequate sample sizes, we classify participants as Caucasian, Asian, and then like this weird group. I'm a little bit mortified about this. It's like non-Asian minority. Like, what does that even mean? And in the back of my mind, I wondered about how racial and ethnic categories were being used in research as it seemed arbitrary and limiting. At the same time, grad school was when I also encountered the replication crisis. So I started grad school around 2009, and the false positive psychology paper came out in 2011. Conversations and research about it really like starting to become more visible in my second and third years. Sabine Vizier came to work in our department in my last quarter of grad school, and I was really impacted by what she was saying about what makes good reproducible science. How can we improve our research practices, and all of these discussions made me rethink assumptions about rigor, validity, and the ways in which we had assumed science should be done. Um, and like I told you, I was like getting really good at like advanced statistical modeling. I became more interested in like modeling lots of data. And like I said, I was really interested in finding out the truth. So over time, though, I realized, okay, wait, depending on the models that I fit, the truth is going to change. This was again just in the back of my mind at the time. And I thought that as long as I was aware of the assumptions behind the models, was rigorous and transparent about how I reported stuff, it would be fine. But then it was also interesting because like where I went to grad school was pretty interesting because they had a whole quantitative psychology area. And this is the first time that I was like, oh, quantitative psychology is a living discipline. Like, did you like I thought that like for some reason, all the stuff that we use to model our data was like frozen in time. It's like from the old days. One of the benefits of being at where I got my PhD was that I was friends with people who were actively working on things like, hey, I'm trying to figure out how to handle this type of data, or I'm challenging the usefulness of this model. I just had no idea. And yeah, so then there's a face. Um, Additionally, one of the projects I had the privilege of working on during this time was using data that focused on Mexican American children and their families in Northern California. And I even got to present on it at my first presentation at the flagship conference in my area of study, which was great. But I started to have questions because, on the one hand, I knew that these data were important as they focused on the experiences of people who weren't really included in my field. But I felt disconnected because the data had already been collected by other people. It was the first time where I started to wonder if it was important at all for researchers to be connected in some way to the participants in their data sets. Okay, so that was grad school. And as some of you may have already experienced, when you're nearing the end of grad school, you got to start thinking about what you're doing next. Um, Typically, right? Like we want continuity in our CVs, so like we got to figure it out. And like in my program, having something lined up was preferred before making plans to graduate. And I remember at the end of my fourth year knowing that I was like totally not ready to apply to professorships. And I started to reach out to people I knew about potential postdocs and ended up applying for one in the Netherlands that was focused on helping to conclude data collection for an ongoing longitudinal study on self-use. And I was still really excited about growing my knowledge on methods and analysis of longitudinal data. So when I got to the Netherlands, I first became exposed to participant engagement in a really kind of like just everybody was sort of doing some form of it. It was my first time being in a department of only or mostly developmental psychologists. I was in a department of developmental psychology, not a general department of psychology. And here I learned about and expanded my understanding of studies or like types of research that required a lot from participants, such as experience sampling studies or other forms of short-term intensive data collection, and studies that were focused on youth, clinical, and forensic populations that are typically harder to reach, harder to engage with. My colleagues were doing things like visiting schools to give public lectures. They were using their existing networks to reach people in the community, and they were asking people from the community what they would like them to research as well. So trying to include the community members' like ideas into the research. They were also sharing results with community members. And this was like altogether, this is a shift for me because my only experience with data collection in grad school was through online surveys, maybe a little bit in the lab. Um, but I never really met any of the participants. And then, I was doing like secondary data analysis, so didn't talk to anybody from those data sets. And then like, right, like the in-person stuff I did was in South Korea, like I told you. I really think this is the first time that I started to realize that the people aspect matters when doing research. So I want to take a little pause here and just be like, well, what is community engaged research? Just in case you're not familiar with this orientation. Um, and it's really just, to me, it's like the easiest way to explain what it is. It's like it is an orientation. It's not a collection of methods per se. It's like how do we approach participants and participants in the community? They're more than just data sources. So community engaged research you can think about as a continuum of community involvement, and there are varied ways that people have approached it. But one thing that's important to know is that it has roots across multiple disciplines. So we have things like pedagogy, social psychology, um, feminist discourse, right? Like with a focus, but like the focus here, like the shared focus is on social change and addressing power imbalances. Community engaged research creates meaningful kind of involvement throughout the research process. And it's particularly important to me, and I think to a lot of folks that use community engaged research for engaging folks that are typically and historically underrepresented. It matters because having this community engaged research orientation, it helps to build trust with community participants and recognizes their lived experience as expertise. It also helps to create meaningful outcomes at multiple levels. So not only for individual participants, not only for broader communities and society, but also in traditional research channels. I just want to, I'm going to skip this. I'll come back to it towards the end. But Yeah, so that's community engaged research. Now I come back to my personal story of my professional development. But so I was in the Netherlands. I was only supposed to be there for a year for a postdoc, but I was actually promoted from postdoc to assistant professor. And I started actually like being like, okay, like I'm an early career researcher. This is awesome. So I started doing all the usual things that you do as an early career person, like applying for grants. And I was getting to know colleagues in and outside of my department. And one of my colleagues, Odelia Lacalia, who was in another department, the medical and clinical psychology at Tilburg University at the time, proposed that we write a grant that would be like basically our interests smushed together. And we both expressed the desire as really young scholars to do something real. And I think it's kind of like one of those things, right? Like you're kind of you're newly independent. You're trying to like be like, well, what did I like from like my grad school days, and where do I see my stuff going? And I think for both of us, we were like, we've done a lot of stuff on secondary data. Like we want to collect our own data, but want to do something that's like happening now. And so we observed that one of the biggest things happening in the Netherlands was the influx of newcomers, and many of them had refugee backgrounds. We also observed that research on those with refugee backgrounds largely focused on immediate needs, but we thought, which is also very, very important, right? But we thought, okay, what if we took a bit of a broader perspective and looked at how is it going for people during the resettlement process, so across a longer period of time. Um, and so what we did was we actually wrote a grant, and we were lucky to receive funding from the John Templeton Foundation, along with several other teams of young researchers, to conduct a longitudinal study that would become known as a character project. And in the character project, we conducted a study that spanned 13 months that included different modes of data collection. And what I want to point out is just that, right, like the question, I guess the core question would be that like, how are people changing and growing um, through adversity, specifically with regards to their emotions and their personality, yeah, like as they are getting settled in the Netherlands. And so we had 13 months where we had a survey every 4 months, and then like our sample was 168 people, with the majority being men, and a sizable amount being women, with of folks that are 28 years old on average. And this, although we didn't use a representative sampling strategy, this actually is seems to correspond with the demographics of folks coming into the Netherlands at the time, where there were more men and lots of young adults coming in. So we had this, just to give you a little bit of a rundown of like the methods that we used. We had a traditional survey or a battery of questionnaires. We also had a daily life component. So this is like kind of like stuff like experience sampling. We also use the electronically activated recorder to pick up on people's like kind of acoustic environment, what was going on in terms of their daily lives in that way, right? So we got self-reports, and then we also got like audio data there. But the reason I think the one thing that I want to talk about the character project is that just that our project changed a lot. And this is really important because this is when I would say is like like I keep saying then I had a turning point, but like this is a really big turning point where after like our project changed so much here that like I would, when I look back on it, I'm like, this is when I was like, wow, there are so many things that I got wrong about research, and there's so many things that I want to do now that are different. But anyways, so our project changed a lot, and the first change was introducing participant engagement into our study. So how did this unfold? And I have to say the first thing that happened was that the ethics board rightly questioned what we were doing for our participants in return for their time. Right. So I just told you about this really intensive like data collection we were doing. And um, they were just kind of like, okay, so that's cool that you want to do this, but how will your potential participants benefit from participating in your study? Are you seriously trying to do this study without thinking about what your participants get out of it? And this was for us a hard pivot, as we had to really rethink our protocol if we wish to conduct our study. We were lucky to have consultants that have previously worked with people facing trauma. So, for example, actually, Ava Alisich, who's at Melbourne right now, props to her. She was one of our consultants. Um, People with refugee backgrounds, and also I had my colleagues in my department to help brainstorm ways to produce or to provide opportunities outside of financial compensation for our participants. And I'll come back to some of the engagement activities we end up incorporating in our study in a little bit. But this is a big change for us. And I think what I want to do here is like highlight how much people change the character project. Um, right? Like earlier, I was like, wow, oh, that's really cool to like connect with people. But like, this is when I was like, dude, this is really for real. So there are several ways in which the people changed the study and ultimately made it successful. So me and Odelia, right? Like we were like, we're going to plan and try to execute a study without knowing anyone from the community. We didn't even ask ourselves if this was weird. I think that reflects our training towards objectivity and distance and detachment from our participants to preserve like that good science thing. And for me, my lack of experience working with folks really was kind of like, oh, okay, yeah, like I made a mistake. And our project changed when we first hired our first junior researchers, Larry and Renee. They knew people in the community. We then met Zaina and Kenan, our first research assistants that were also Syrian themselves. They were young people who'd come to resettle in the Netherlands. They were community members. We were so incredibly lucky to have them join our team because then everything got so much like better. Like we grew our team. We were able to meet in person with every participant with a mobile lab with the right. Like these are ideas that came from this team. The Netherlands has an awesome transportation system. It's a relatively small country, which made this feasible, like going to meet every participant. And for the first three waves, we were able to do that. And then pandemic happened and we moved online. But meeting participants where they were, at libraries, cafes, even in their homes, it transformed how we were able to understand their daily lives. Like instead of viewing them only as data points, we got to see their routines, their challenges, and the ways they made meaning of their experiences. All these things I think I would have written off before as like methodological problems because I'm like, oh no, like we're like not distant anymore. But I think that these really became meaningful connections that made the work better. Um, so let me tell you how it made the work better. Meeting our participants also, it allowed us to ensure that our materials were appropriate. So we had already been doing all this like prep work with Zaina and Keenan and others to make sure the materials were like translated well. We like use these really elaborate procedures, but like having those like soft moments of interaction, it allowed us to like, for example, like hear from participants when they were like, this item is offensive. Um, I think it was like an item from like the Harvard Trauma Questionnaire where there's something about God, like blaming God for something, and we heard from I think a few participants that were like, "This is I don't even know how to answer this. Like this is really not okay." And so we were able to change it, like to adapt to them and what they were saying. We also got to learn that they would like to tell us more things about them that weren't covered in the questionnaires they completed. So while open-ended questions were limited in the first assessment, we were able to expand in later assessments. And like there's just some really interesting things that came out of it. So I can't remember everything now, but like one thing that I always like just think is really cool is like through some of these yeah, like one participant was like, "Hey, I fell in love in the past year and I want to tell you about it." And that's like really awesome and really cool. And I don't think we definitely wouldn't have gotten that as like any sort of data if we didn't ask like in an open-ended way, like, what else would you like to share about your experiences? So that's really awesome. And then interestingly, we also like by meeting with our participants, they actually told us like, hey, can we not meet with researchers who are always like, can we not always meet with Syrian researchers? Because they actually were like, hey, I want to meet with a, a Dutch person so I could practice my Dutch, or I just want to talk to like an international person in English. Like that was really interesting to us because I think we had assumed like, oh, like cultural sensitivity, like shared experience. Of course, they would want a Syrian researcher at every assessment, but that was not the case. And we wouldn't have known this if we didn't, you know, talk with them. So I think I was gonna, I think I told you few minutes back that I was going to show you how we engage with participants. And so this is our first foray, right? And so we created an advisory board, and this is of people who were right, like had worked with um, people with refugee backgrounds who were serving them in a clinical sense and also in other ways, or who were Syrian themselves, right? We had like a nice group of folks that were helping us problem solve with recruitment, with materials, with just yeah, study stuff that inevitably comes up, and that was really great. Um, we also offered newsletters after each assessment. So here's one for every wave. And in the first wave, we have things like, oh, here's some resources for newcomers that you may or may not have heard of. Here's some facts about like just basic demographics about who you guys are. And then some other updates and pictures of us. To accompany them, we also had swag. People like swag. So here we have like a grocery tote, a water bottle, an agenda, or like a planner, and then even a plantable newsletter that goes along with the theme of like personal growth. Additionally, we conducted a follow-up study, just asking them, how was your experience with the study? How's everything going now? We also did things like have an end of project event with a roundtable, which is really cool. We had participants. This is unfortunately or fortunately, it happened on Zoom. I think like it increased accessibility in some ways, but it would have been really cool to meet in person. But it was like really like lockdown time at that point. And so we had participants join us and where we talked about how it was going with the project as we were wrapping it up. Also, we had a participant do some storytelling. It was just really cool. We got feedback from our participants. It was really a fun time. We also did things like online seminars. So in Arabic, Dutch, and English on topics such as expressive writing, identity development, and growth. We also did one on collective leadership, which is really cool. There's Ava Alisich. We also provided an online space for interested participants to share their artwork in the form of an electronic book. So all of this is so cool. It really like dipping our toes into the engagement waters. It made us really realize that teamwork and community involvement are crucial to making the research better and also more meaningful. So I want to pause here to share some insights that came out of the work on the character project. And the first is that consideration of insider and outsider status is critical. So maybe just because we thought of a thing, we're not the best people to research it. Or if we really want to do it, right, after reflecting on this, teamwork is really important here. So yeah, like my co-investigator and I had gone into the project thinking that we really wanted to make a project that we couldn't do alone and that we wanted to do something on current events. But what we really missed was that we weren't part of the community. We weren't even spending time with people from the community. We should have spent time with community members and included them in the research team from the very beginning. Second is like planning to be flexible should be really built into the expectations for the project, even more so than I think we always tend to like with any research project where like there's going to be room for like errors, going to be stuff that comes up. But I think what I learned here is just that we need to be super, super flexible and kind of see it as, right, like not frame it as like, oh no, like this thing is going on, but it's like this is a challenge that like we can all kind of come together and address. And then related to that is just that I think one insight that has that research should be done with lots of reflection throughout the process, not just at the beginning. Also, that there's meaning in the process of doing research and that we can always work towards repairing when we have hit low points or realize that we didn't make the best decisions, as long as we have this kind of vibe of accountability and transparency. Another thing is that engagement with participants and community is critical for this work to happen, and that we should try to enrich participation with meaningful experiences in addition to financial compensation. Seeing how much better the project was because of the contributions of our Syrian researchers made me also rethink this distance perspective of remember like there's like an like we need to be objective. I realized here that actually there's so much value in me search, right? Like Zaina and Keenan being Syrian newcomers themselves, them being part of that team, made the project so much better that I was like, wow, I really think that all this stuff, like on lived experiences, all like just that we should give respect to this type of work because, and not dismiss it because it makes, it just makes the research better, more accurate, and more impactful. And then related to that is just maybe there isn't one singular truth. So I think that in all my efforts to be like, okay, stats, advanced longitudinal models, advanced everything, numbers, they're going to get us to the truth. I think I just finally was like, okay, multiple perspectives must be considered. So at the tail end of the character project, I moved to Toronto for another assistant professorship. This was in August of 2018. And when I started my job at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, we were nearing the end of data collection and preparing for our events. Moving continents into a place that seemed familiar but was not super familiar, right? Like there's still like a US Canadian, I think there's actually quite a lot of difference. Um, but anyways, I just went off on a detour. It gave me time to reflect on how the character project was going. And so my team and I ended up writing a paper on our reflections in the European Journal of Personality. And when I got to Canada, I noticed a few things. First, the Greater Toronto area is huge. Mississauga, where I work, is extremely multicultural. There really isn't a huge majority of any one ethnic group like how I experienced in California. Second, I realized that students were coming to me as one of the only like racial and ethnic minority people on the psychology faculty. I was hearing so much about the racialized experience at university. I think in part because like, right, like it, even though the student body was diverse, like the faculty didn't necessarily like reflect that, like the makeup of the faculty. So being one of the onlys allowed me to get this like insider perspective that I think maybe my other colleagues didn't get because the students were really kind of identifying with me and wanting to tell me like how things were going. This and also 2020 in general redirected me towards wanting to work towards change in ways that I had more control over. So I was already lucky to be part of a pre-tenure faculty of color group of social and personality psychologists called Flourish. I also co-organized an EDI group or Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion group across the different psychology departments at the three University of Toronto um, campuses. I also co-organized a group for Asian identified scholars in psychology. And in 2021, I was doing things like co-chairing a wacky online version of the Association for Research on Personality that was focused on issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I joined a working group at U of T that was about anti-Asian racism. And so, like, why am I telling you this? It's because people at my university and in the field were coming to me with like asking me, what did I think about this issue pertaining to equity, diversity, and inclusion? And I felt like the universe was pointing me towards the racialized experience at my university. This nicely interfaced with my research interests, you know, things that I like. I like emerging adulthood. I like transitions. Like, I think that people from minoritized groups need more research airtime. I like feelings. I like personality, etc. And so I was like, okay, I think I want to head this way. But here I wanted to do things a little bit better than I thought I had with the character project. So I decided to focus on the community engaged aspect a little bit more from the beginning. Um, I began talking with a colleague from Flourish, Kelsey Harris, who I ended up drawing later, who is also in personality psychology and who postdoced at the University of Toronto, who is also an assistant professor at a Canadian university. All right, so we had these conversations, me and Kelsey, in passing, that personality psychology in particular had a diversity problem. And we thought, okay, let's team up, let's write a grant, let's look at the personality development of racial and ethnic minority students. I forgot to tell you, we tend to use the term racialized in Canada. But we allowed it, but the grant writing was interesting because it was the first time being like, we're actually going to allow it to be pretty open-ended in terms of the exact constructs, measures, and methods, and expand on the engagement part of the study more. We applied, we were lucky to be successful in obtaining funding for a project that would be called Giving Voice that was funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And for giving voice, we started with this perspective shift that I just described to you. So we're already there. We're like, we wanna be more engaged, even if it's like a traditional. Like it's funny. It's a little bit meta because it's like some people are like, well, aren't you still doing like research like on university students? But we're taking this intentional approach, using a community engaged research orientation to get to know about the experiences of racial and ethnic minorities um, at the university, right? So we started this perspective shift, and we also had a funding timeline that was longer, which allowed us to do a lot of preparatory work for conducting the actual study. So it's a 5-year timeline instead of like the 2-year one that we had for the character project. We also built a diverse research team from the outset. And Giving Voice launched in the summer of 2024 when students were just about to start their first year of university. And our plans are to hopefully continue until at least summer of 2028 when they have completed their 4th year. And so this kind of looks familiar, right? Like the setup of a slide, because I made a similar one for the character project. And you can see like the basic research theme is it's interesting, but it's also very similar to like what I care about, just emotions, personality. But the added component is looking at specific racialized experiences um, for these students. And we are we've been recruiting all year. We have done 4, or we're in the middle of our 4th survey assessment, and we have reached 369 people so far. And like character, there are multiple modes of data collection. So we've got that questionnaire. We've added things like what are your experiences with discrimination and belonging, right? We're getting at that, the racialized experiences bit. We have a daily life component where we've added some passive sensing methods, and we have those narratives. We've also brought into other methods like focus groups. So we're just getting ready to start holding focus groups with uh, participants that identify as Black. And that's going to be really cool. Also on queer people of color. So we all that to say is that we have these additional components too that are going to be determined with the participants and the research team. So we're doing it all this like summer uh, because we have built in that greater flexibility because we want to make sure that the participants can kind of help steer the study, right? We want to hear from them. And that's like, I think that's like the biggest difference from, I would say, the character project. Okay, so how have we been using community engaged research practices? Before the study started, we actually, right, we did a lot of preparatory work. I'll tell you more about it in a sec, but or why in a second. But we were able to run these cool focus groups where we asked folks to come in and tell us about like things, like semi-structured interview questions about like personality, like relationships, family, etc. But we also had this open-ended part where just like, hey, we want to do like this longitudinal study about people like you. What do you think we should study? And they gave us really cool ideas. Um, so we did that. We also did some pilot studies, some of which we published in terms of like, for example, we had a daily life study that we piloted and came out in Journal of Personality. We also just did like a regular pilot study that included like asking folks like to pretend that they're filling out the surveys that we would want to administer. Ask them, was it fun, is it relevant, is it is there do you have any comments for us about this? um, and then from a subset of those folks we asked them to come in to do cognitive interviews, and that was really cool. And we also, here is just kind of like we have these little fact sheets that we made Instagram slides for, telling folks what we found. We created an advisory board. We also have swag. Um, we had a newsletter in the spring. And we also have done a lot of events with participants in the community. I think we've done more than 24 events. And this is only because we were able to collaborate with university groups. So things like hanging out with the Center for Student Engagement to talk about how to get involved in research, going on nature walks with UTM Walks. We created a zine with our participants about the first year experience, which is really cool, and lots more. Even though I felt like we were more prepared for giving voice, it still has been a balancing act for the past 11 months that the study has been running. So ethical reviews delayed our study by a year. Um, sometimes that happens, and um, it was interesting here because is a specific thing where I think that people on the ethics board were really concerned that focusing on the racialized experience meant that our population was at risk due to asking them about discrimination, which, to be fair, like to be honest, my research team and I thought was kind of interesting because we, as racialized people ourselves, we were like, well, try experiencing racism first. Sometimes it's actually really nice to be able to share and give voice to those experiences, but still, it was a delay that we dealt with, and we were ultimately really grateful for it. And we also faced scrutiny over our recruitment methods and how we framed the study's purpose. This is not even specific to my institution. Like, I can understand that the university might be a little bit worried about supporting recruitment for a project that might reveal ways in which the university has been lacking in their support of racialized students. But, it was kind of like a thing that we had to deal with. And it is interesting to think about ways in which we could have framed this research to be maybe more, I don't know, like basically 70% of our subject pool is visible minority. So, you know what I mean? Anyways, okay. So, and then another thing that we kind of, that has been part of the balancing act is like lived experience is really awesome. It can be really wonderful, but it can also be very hard. So we, as a whole team of racialized folks at different phases of our lives, um, we, um, we identify with our research topics, our participants, right? And some of it is really uplifting, and some of it can be very distressing, and it can be a lot. And, I've been talking with people about this. It's like we joke about like we don't know how researchers can do this work well without a lot of psychological clarity and maybe therapy. Just hits close to home sometimes. And also it just takes a lot of time, energy, and resources to be this engaged. Um, right? Like to do all those events, to do all the arms of the project, to make sure we're still in contact with our participants. It's resource intensive. I think also that I forget that no matter how many times I've learned a thing, that different challenges arise, like a game of whack-a-mole. And sometimes, even though I've been like, this is an awesome approach, being from a traditionally trained or being traditionally trained, right, in that like experimental psychology tradition is that how do we integrate all these methods? How do we unlearn some of these dominant perspectives? I've had to actively speak to my research team about this, which has encouraged me and my research team to interrogate that good science trope. What are our assumptions? What do we think are legit ways of finding out more about people, and where do they come from? So the bright side of all of this, though, is that IRB delays have allowed us a lot of time to prepare, right? We were able to do those focus groups. We were able to like pilot really well. That was awesome. Just to let our process breathe a little bit. Researchers assume that sensitive topics harm participants, but actually what we have seen is like people want to share. And that's been really cool to be like witness to that. Students on my team are seeing themselves represented in a really large government funded project, which is really cool for them, and also like their families. Like their families are like, wow, legit, like you're part of this really, like the government is funding it. That's amazing. So they're seeing themselves represented, and we're getting our publications out there. They're on those papers. It's really cool. And participants are building community with each other through our events. So one thing I didn't get to mention in the previous slide about how we're engaged is that we did a Lunar New Year paper cutting thing. And that was really cool because I don't know, I think also just like if I think about if was a student at this time, I think it would be really cool and extremely powerful to know, to come to an event where you're celebrating that heritage, that part of you, to celebrate the new year with um, our Asian students came to celebrate. They got to know each other. They got to see themselves represented. I think that's really amazing. And then finally, we were getting support from colleagues in and outside of the institution. Like it's been really cool to be like, hey, this orientation is really cool towards community engaged research, and people are like, yeah, we like it, and hopefully you like it too. Okay, so now I want to close with a summary of what using an engaged approach in my research has taught me. The first is that there's value for participants. Participants are psyched. They're like, this work is important. I'm proud to contribute to it. Participants get to be part of a community. Participants get to see themselves in that research, right? Participants are seen as people that matter. And also, I think that using an engaged approach has made me realize that the research is better. Like you get better quality research, potentially higher retention rates. Again, like right now, this is anecdotal, but I think just connecting has helped participants want to commit to the longitudinal project they're staying in the study. We also get a more holistic perspective by incorporating strengths-based approaches. So what I mean by this is like once you realize that your participants are multifaceted people, you want to know more about the good with the bad, you want a more balanced understanding. I think that we also get more careful and accurate reporting results because we're there with the participants, we're there like throughout all the research activities. We can see what's going on, we can provide more context around the data. And then additional insights that I have, and then I'll close, is just that it's a reality check. Like using this community engaged research orientation has just really reminded me of that psychology is complex. Human behavior is really complex. We're always approximating something. And then asking participants what they want us to research can help make research more impactful as they don't always align with our research interests, right? Like I wouldn't say that I'm like a mental health researcher actually, right? But like doing this project has really oriented me towards being like, yeah, like this stuff really matters. I know that sounds really funny coming from a psychologist, but I wouldn't have necessarily been like going towards this direction. But our participants are like, yeah, we want to talk about it. We want to talk about our friends. We want to talk about spirituality. We want to talk about our families. It's really interesting. Um, and also, I think, just to not go all like it's awesome, but we also have to be intentional, right? Like an engaged approach works well, but it requires careful consideration of participant capacity. So, we got to make sure like, can the participants actually, do they have the bandwidth to engage? Do the methods that we want to use fit with this approach and orientation? And do we have those available resources? So I'm going to close for now. I want to thank you as an audience member. I want to thank all the folks that I've worked with as part of the Character Project and Giving Voice, my funders, and I want to invite you to get in touch with me if you have any questions or thoughts that you'd like to share. I want to thank you again, and thanks to the University of Melbourne for allowing me to be a Brotherton Fellow. And that's it for now. Take care and hope to stay in touch. Okay, bye.